Today's scripture reading comes from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Repeat, the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, which I'll read right now. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights, 3 days, nights or day. And my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This is the word of the Lord. The Bible passages, the readings we've had for our daily Bible reading from this past week from the book of Esther, and the next few days are also from the book of Esther. We'll be reading all the book of Esther for last week and the next few days. But I want to consider and think about the entire book of Esther as a whole. The book of Esther functions as one self-contained story, and I want to think about not just this passage, but all the events in the book of Esther. And so the events of the book of Esther itself are dramatic, romantic, adventurous, and epic. An hour west of here, there's this theater called Sight and Sound. For those of you who do not know about it, it's like a massive high-tech Broadway theater, but in the middle of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So it's kind of peculiar. It's a state-of-the-art New York-style Broadway theater surrounded by farms and Amish people. Very high production value, lights, glitzy costumes, singing, and lots of real goats, horses, and camels on stage. Oh yeah, and by the way, the productions are exclusively Bible stories, if you didn't know that. Not just Christian stories, but exclusively Bible stories. But Bible stories in the form of musical theater with jazz hands. I think I've been there twice in my life. A few years ago, actually, I saw a production of Esther. It was a dramatization of the book that we're reading right now. And it was what you would expect it to be, dramatic, exciting, and over the top. Because the book of Esther itself lends itself to the theatrical. The book of Esther, Sight and Sound, they're actually a perfect fit for one another. A few years ago, I was reminded that a bunch of women for women's ministry went out there to watch the production of Esther. Do any of you remember that? Some of you might have been there. Perhaps some of you remember that. And when you read the book of Esther, maybe for those who are there, like me, this musical pops up in your mind. And for those of you who did not go on that trip, or some of you may not have had the chance to read this past week, I want to spend the first part of the sermon just giving you a synopsis of the events of this book, an exposition of the book of Esther. It's quite a dramatic, fun, interesting, epic story. So the events take place in Susa, which is the capital of Persia. And the main characters, or the main people in the story are Mordecai and his cousin Esther. Now, Esther's parents are dead, and Mordecai, though cousin, is more like an uncle or a father. He acts as her father figure. Mordecai is Esther's guardian, essentially her father. And they are part of a minority community of Jews living in Persia. And there is the king of Persia, who is essentially a drunken fool who is easily manipulated from one direction to the other. And then there's also a Persian official named Haman, who is cunning and evil. He is the villain of this story. So those are the four main people in this story and the events that is in the book of Esther. So the book of Esther begins with the king of Persia, who throws himself two elaborate banquets or parties. These two parties last a total of 187 days. The purpose of his parties was to show off and display his greatness and glory, power, and wealth to anyone who could see them. As an aside, I would have a very hard time imagining drinking and partying for 187 days. I don't know how you actually pull that off. And I have an even harder time actually enjoying that. That actually sounds like torture to me. But for the king of Persia, that's exactly what he wanted to do. On the last day of the banquet, party day 187, he got really drunk, I suppose even more drunk than he'd been the previous days. It really built up in the system. And he commands that his queen, Queen Vashti, show up and display herself at the banquet and show off her beauty. Do a little turnaround. Get your best clothes, best hair, and just walk through and show all my drunken friends how pretty you are. It's not about her, it's about him. He wanted everyone to know, look how pretty and expensive and rich my trophy wife is. Vashti, apparently being a proud woman, refused to come. Again, I suppose she didn't really like the idea of having to display herself like some object, a pretty new toy. Like, let me show you my Ferrari, my racehorse, and my wife. She didn't really want to be one of those things. She's not an object. So the king, in his drunken rage, when he finds out that Vashti refused to come, deposes and banishes Vashti. She's no longer allowed in the palace. He essentially divorces her and exiles her away from his presence. All right. So now the king needs a new queen. So he held a nationwide beauty contest. And there's this young Jewish woman named Esther, and she was beautiful. And somehow or another, in this nationwide beauty contest, she is selected as a finalist, and then she was placed in the king's harem. Now, Mordecai, the father figure of Esther, instructed Esther to keep her Jewish identity a secret. And Esther, along with the other finalists, was put through, quite literally, a 1-year beauty boot camp. The world's most amazing and elaborate beauty makeover possibly in the history of the universe. They were just made to be more beautiful than they already were. Clothes, lotion, perfume, makeup, hair, I suppose. And the selected women in the harem then had the opportunity to have sex with the king to help him decide who was the best, who he wanted. The king essentially takes the most beautiful women in the kingdom for a test drive. Try them out. Well, that's really, what do you call it? Yuck and ick. But there you go. Esther was a king's favorite, and she wins the beauty contest. The king liked her so much that he married her and elevated her to become the new queen of Persia. She replaces Vashti. Crazy, right? What are the chances? What are the odds that Esther wins this beauty contest and becomes a queen? Well, Mordecai, as a concerned guardian of Esther, had been hanging around the palace to check in on her. And while he's around the palace, doing his dutiful duty to guard Esther and make sure she's okay, he just happens to hear 2 royal guards plotting to kill the king of Persia. So then Mordecai tells Esther that the king is going to be assassinated, and Esther tells the king, and then Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. So Mordecai just happened to hear a plot. He told Esther, who just happened to be the queen of Persia, and she tells the king. What are the chances, right? Crazy coincidence. Now, around the same time, the second most powerful person in Persia was Haman, the evil, cunning villain of the story. Now, Haman is elevated to the second most powerful position in Persia. He's like the prime minister. He's high. And then the king ordered all people to bow down before Haman whenever they saw him. Now, Mordecai, being a proud man, for reasons we don't really know, refused to bow down before Haman. And this enraged Haman. Now, for a lot of reasons, Haman hated Mordecai, but Haman had a long-standing grudge and hatred of all the Jews living in Persia. So then Haman talks to the king and easily convinces the king to kill all the Jews living in Persia. That's really extreme, but again, for some reason, Haman really, really hates all the Jews. And then Haman, the king, got really drunk to celebrate this awful decree. So it looks like the Jews in Babylon are doomed. There is no hope, except for Esther. Mordecai and Esther make a desperate plan. She's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king, which had been a secret up till now, and then ask the king to reverse the decree ordering the death of all Jews, because if you have to kill all Jews, then you're going to have to kill Esther along with it and all the people Esther loves. Okay, so that's a plan. But there's a problem. At this time, in this place, in this culture, in this legal system, in Persia, you can't just talk to the king. You can't just go to the king and say, I want to talk to you. Or she can't even, as queen, say, hey, hubby, my husband, let's talk. I got something to deal with. There's something we have to bring up. You can't talk to the king unless the king points to you and invites you to talk to the king. And if you do talk to the king without being invited to do so, You will be executed, even if you're the queen and the wife of the king. So there's a plan, but it is a risky plan. And in fact, Esther is risking her life. She is apprehensive and fearful, and scared, of course. Who wouldn't be? And Mordecai says to Esther these famous words, which I just read at the beginning of the sermon, which I'll read again. This is what Mordecai tells Esther. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Again, coincidence, right? It all works out together. It's no guarantee it's going to work out, though. No one knows the future. Esther responds with these words, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So that's a plan. But before these things can happen, there are some other events that happen related in the book of Esther. One night, after drinking with the king, again, lots of drinking in the story, lots of drunkenness. This king drinks a lot. Haman sees Mordecai on the streets. And again, Haman doesn't bow, probably. He remembers Mordecai's a guy that won't bow. And he gets so angry, he orders gallows to be built. Then he orders Mordecai to be hanged on it. Okay, now things are looking really, really bad and hopeless for the Jews and Mordecai. All the Jews can get wiped out. And Mordecai has been sentenced to death. However, that very night, the king couldn't sleep. He was suffering from insomnia. Happens, I get that sometimes. And so he orders his servants to read him something that would surely put him to sleep and fix his problem of sleeplessness at night. He tells them, get the official royal chronicles of great deeds. Yeah, that's interesting. And so I think what happened, the servant just sort of picked a random volume off the shelf and he just started reading things that happened during his reign. And it just so happened he started reading the part years ago where Mordecai saves the king's life. Crazy, right? What are the chances? The king then realized he forgot all about this, and now he remembers that Mordecai saved his life. And he asked his servants, what's the part in which, how did I reward this Mordecai guy? What did he get for saving my life? And there's nothing. He actually forgot to reward Mordecai. He said, well, that's a bummer. I'm going to fix this problem. The next day, Haman came to the king to request the execution of Mordecai. But the king spoke first. And he asked Haman the following questions. I'm paraphrasing. There's not the words of the Bible, but I'm paraphrasing. Essentially, the king asked Haman, what should I do to someone who honors the king, who the king honors? Now, Haman is thinking, he's talking about me. So Haman says, thinking about himself, put royal robes on me. I mean him, whoever you're thinking about. Put a royal crown on my head. I mean his head. And put him on a royal horse and get the most noble official to lead this guy through the city square shouting, the king honors this person. The king says, I'm paraphrasing, great idea. Now Haman is thinking, I'm going to get the reward, which I just wrote for myself. But then the king orders Haman, get Mordecai the Jew and do everything you just said, and you lead him through the city square, just like you recommended. That's a great idea. And just like that, Mordecai's life just did a 180-degree pivot. He went from a death sentence to, at that moment, being the most honored person in the entire kingdom, led through the city square by the very person who tried to have him executed. Again, crazy, right? What are the chances? Just a coincidence, another coincidence. Eventually, Esther manages to tell the king about Haman's plot to kill the Jews. Then the king, in a drunken rage, again, more drunkenness, this guy drinks a lot of rage, orders Haman to be executed. And Haman's hanged on the very gallows he had built for the purpose of executing Mordecai. As an aside, there are some disputes with the translation of hanging and gallows. It's more likely that it was a spike, and they were like impaled on the spike high above everyone for them to see. It doesn't really matter. It's a death. It's nasty. It's gruesome. But again, instead, the very thing that was designed for the death of Mordecai is now being used by the guy who designed it for Mordecai, and Haman himself was killed on that very object, be it a gallows or a spike. What are the chances? Crazy, right? Again, you see a pattern, a reversal, a pivot. Things that look awful, just in a moment, become the very opposite of awful, become your salvation, the great reversal. We see the story pattern over and over again so far in this story. And then Mordecai is elevated to the second highest position in Persia, replacing Haman. And then the king gives, Eventually, Esther manages to tell the king about Haman's plot to kill the Jews. And that's when the king ordered Haman to be executed. Mordecai is elevated to the second highest position in Persia. And then the king gives the Jews permission to kill all of Haman's family and anyone who plotted to kill the Jews. And they do. The Jews live. Haman's family's all massacred. All the people who are part of this conspiracy are killed. And the Jews celebrate. This entire story could be seen as a series of impossible coincidences and unexpected reversals. To repeat and review what you already know, instead of the Jews getting wiped out, Haman and his family and his allies all get wiped out. Instead of Haman being honored by the king, Mordecai gets honored by the king. Instead of Mordecai getting publicly executed, Haman is publicly executed. And all hinged on this. Esther just happened to win a kingdom-wide beauty contest. Esther is made queen at the very time when she was in a position to save the Jews from annihilation and extermination. And as Mordecai said, these famous words, "Who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this?" This is the right time for you to be here, for you to be where you are, to do all these things, to save all your people. How do you explain all this? How did this all happen? This is just a series of crazy, unexpected, unlikely coincidences, right? This happens sometimes, right? This is just how the laws of probability work out. This is just how life works, isn't it? No, of course not. This can't happen. The answer is obvious. Clearly, God is in charge of everything. God is coordinating all these events like a playwright, like a model builder. He sees a whole story from his position in heaven, and he's working all these details out to be just perfect for such a time as this. You win the beauty contest at this time, in this year. Mordecai is in the gates, hearing the assassination plots. God saves his people from annihilation through the coordination of many, many circumstances and variables. Esther and Mordecai did their best to make decisions to save their people. But no person or no people could have ever plotted this out. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much planning you do, no matter how much information you have at your fingertips, you could have never plotted this out. You do the best you can, but you only occupy a small part of the world. Your realm of knowledge is tiny. It's only God who sees the big picture, who sees everything, who understands every variable, who sees beyond time and space, could ever coordinate this stuff to work out. No one person, no people could have ever made this work out. Only God could make this happen. And this is the way God works in our lives. God is always working all the time. Let me repeat, that could be a theme or lesson from the book of Esther. God is always working all the time. God is always doing something in the world and in our lives. God has a plan. He's writing a story. He's working out his purposes. And he's just using us in our lives to advance his goals, his agenda, which are good, holy, and godly. But most of the time, we don't know what God's up to. Esther doing her little thing, bit by bit by bit. Mordecai making decisions bit by bit at a time. They have no idea how it all is going to work out. They don't understand how it all, the conjunction of all these events. Us too, we do the best we can in our lives. We don't know what it means, not completely. And even when we think we know, we only get a glimmer, a fraction, a sliver of the total picture. We know about this much of what's going on. The big picture is wide. We get like a 1-degree angle on what's going on in the work of God. And we just do the best we can with what we have. In the moments, especially in the moments that are incredibly stressful and incredibly boring, very dramatic or very dull, you can't see what God's doing in your life. And you can't see how your life adds to God's bigger picture, or how anything you're doing in life adds to any purpose. Do the little pieces of my life, my little decisions, does my life entirely, all of it, does it mean anything? Does it connect to anything? Are the things I'm going through right now, how are they helping me? Helping God, helping his kingdom? How am I of benefit to anyone else? You might feel like this when your life is boring. Or you feel like you're on a treadmill going nowhere. You feel like your life is about a futility. It doesn't add up to anything. Or what the opposite, you're not bored. It's actually quite dramatic. Your life's just falling apart. It's crumbling before your eyes, and nothing you can do is helping or solving or making anything better. Nothing's improving. You wonder, what does this mean? This futility of my life. It doesn't mean anything. Your life might seem pointless and without direction sometimes. It's because our perspective is so limited and narrow. We just can't help it. We're limited beings. But this is a message of Esther. God is always doing something all the time. We don't know what he's up to. It's only at the end of Esther. It's only the very, very end, the last chapter, we see what God is really, really up to. And bit by bit, the purposes of all the previous events start making sense. This led to this. This connected with this. And that led to this. You only see it at the end. But until the end, it just looks terrible. It looks random. Nothing's making sense. There may be moments, years after, or decades into our lives, where we look backwards and we connect the dots of our lives. And we can see how God coordinates things in our lives to be surprising and beautiful and amazing. But even then, at those moments, those aha moments, when you realize what it all meant, we still only get a glimpse, a sliver, a fraction, because God's ways are mysterious and beyond us. And it takes faith to believe that God has a plan, that God is working on something, that God's cooking something. So we just don't know. So again, we follow the model of Esther and Mordecai. We just do the best we can with what we have, what God's allowed us to see and know. And we trust that God has a purpose and plans beyond our ability to know. That is a message of the book of Esther. Now I want to take a hard pivot. I want to point out some very strange and odd and problematic things about the book of Esther. I'm not trying to undermine anything I just said. I believe that. I believe everything I just said is still true. But actually, this book is a lot more complicated than you get when you go to Sight and Sound. Or if you think that this is just a great, dramatic, beautiful story. It is, but it's actually complicated. I want to point out at least 2 problems. Problem 1, if you read this book, you notice God is never mentioned. In fact, this is the only book of the Bible where God is never mentioned. No one calls upon the name of the Lord. Even after it's all over, no one thanks God. Even after all these miraculous, amazing events, no one attributes anything to God. At the very end of the book, you think the last verse should be, look at what the Lord has done. Praise God. That verse, or any verse, there's no verse in the Bible, in the book of Esther that's even remotely like that. God's name is never mentioned. God never shows up, and God's never called upon or attributed. Nothing's ever attributed to God. Why is this? It's a strange that the book of the Bible would be so glaringly, obviously silent about God. There are various theories. One argument is that the author is clever. He did this on purpose. It forces a reader to have faith. We need to see the guidance and providence of God even when God appears to be absent. Even when you can't see God, he's there acting all the time. Let me give an example of a contrast. In the book of Exodus, when God is guiding the people of Israel out of Egypt, he guided them with a tower of flame and a tower of smoke. I mean, you could see it, right? You're following flame and smoke. And when the Jews are trapped between the Red Sea and the chariots of Pharaoh, they were doomed. They're going to die. Option A, drown in the Red Sea. Option A, drown in the Red Sea. Option B, get slaughtered by chariots. There's no option C. There's no third option. They were doomed. And just like what Haman was going to do to the Jews, right? But then God shows up in the most unexpected way. The Egyptian army was going to kill the Jews, but God intervenes. They parts the Red Sea. God creates a third option. No one saw that one coming. Clearly, I can see the tower of flame. I can see tower of smoke. I can see the Red Sea parting, and I can walk through it. Probably even feel the water splashing on my face. God dramatically annihilates the enemy. You can see that, feel that, experience that. That's the big pivot in that story. In the Exodus story, the salvation of God, what saves the Jews from annihilation and genocide, it's obvious. God shows up. God is there. Can't deny it. God saves his people with many, many visible miracles. In Esther, actually, it's almost the same story. The same things happen. There's a big pivot, the twist. The people that were seeking to kill the Jews, be it Haman and his friends or the Pharaoh's armies, they get killed. But in the book of Esther, God does show up. God is there. God does save his people just as much as he did in the book of Esther. But this time, God is hidden. But he's still there. Just because God's hidden and doesn't show up in some dramatic way doesn't mean he's not there. He's as real as ever. His presence, his guidance, his protection is as real and as present, as close to you as ever. You just can't see it. He is acting. God is cooking. God is planning. God is intervening. God is doing his thing. He's working out his will. But in the book of Esther, it's all behind the scenes. So the author of the book of Esther does not mention God to teach us a lesson. We need faith to believe that God, in a God who loves us and guides us, even when we can't see him. So sometimes, actually in my life, most of the time, God intentionally hides himself from us. It's not that God had a list of things to do, and one of them, 15 out of 94, was show up. I just forgot that one. Just slipped my mind. It's not that God forgot to make himself visible to us. He does it on purpose. He is intentionally hiding himself from us in that visible way. God seems absent or unknowable, beyond our reason. And sometimes in our lives, or oftentimes in our lives, God's actions in our lives and God's actions in the world seem puzzling or even frightening. Oftentimes when great evil is in the world, or you're suffering for reasons you cannot understand, you wonder, where is God in this? And God seems absent. God seems hidden. He's doing something, and it makes absolutely no sense. Martin Luther calls this the hidden God, or the fancy Latin word Martin Luther uses as Deus absconditus. This is in contrast to the revealed God, the hidden God, the revealed God. The revealed God, the fancy Latin term for that is Deus revelatus, the revealed God. So think of Esther, Deus abscondius, the hidden God. The book of Exodus, Deus revelatus, the revealed God. They're both God, the hidden God and the revealed God. They're the same God. And it's not like he's kind of present in one and really present in the other. He's really, really present in both. One we can see and one we can't. And God does it on purpose. It's not he forgot to show up in some visible way. God's intentionally hiding himself. Isaiah 45, verse 15 says, "Truly you are a God who has been hiding himself, the God and Savior of Israel." I want to read that verse again. I love that verse. It's a short little verse, but it's fascinating. Truly you are a God who has been hiding himself, the God and Savior of Israel. God is saving Israel, and at the same time, he's hiding himself from Israel. It's on purpose. I don't know why he does on purpose, but he does. It's what he's doing. So maybe in your own life, you're suffering, you're miserable, you're a victim of evil. Horrible things are happening to you. People are betraying you. You feel lost. And worst of all, and I really do mean this, the worst part of it is you feel like God is absent. It's bad enough that the world's hurt you. Now you feel like God's left you alone. You are abandoned. You feel completely alone. And you can't see what's going on. You're confused. Well, perhaps, as Isaiah says, or actually not perhaps, listen to the words of Isaiah. All right? God is saving you, and he's hiding himself from you. The absence of God, or the seeming absence of God, is not the absence of God, but he's saving you. He's working on you. Why would he do that? Well, that's a longer story, but I think he's building your faith. He's building your trust in him. That was problem one, the hidden God. Here's problem two, not really a problem, just an oddity, a curiosity, something that strikes you as peculiar about this book. These people, the Jews in the book of Esther, and, Haman and Mordecai as well, Haman, Mordecai, and the king, this entire episode is not particularly holy or righteous. Throughout this whole story, there's drunkenness, there's murder, sex, there's lots of violations of the Torah. Eating impure foods, marrying a Gentile. Esther and Mordecai do not seem to be acting in a particularly Jewish manner. It's curious. Prayer is never mentioned in the book, though fasting is. Mordecai and Esther never pray. Maybe they do, but maybe that's happening off scene where that maybe the book never mentions it, but they were never said that they pray. Both Esther and Mordecai seem to be lacking any spiritual awareness, except the assurance that God, the God who's never mentioned, by the way, spoken by absence, perhaps you will be saved. They never say God will save us. There's a belief that God, sort of, kinda, will protect his people. Again, they never mention God. And they don't appear to practice any rituals of the Jewish religion. Maybe they do, but I think it's curiously absent in the book. That never shows up. In general, these people don't appear to be pious or observant Jews who are following the law. They're Jews who aren't being Jewish. Maybe they are, but it's just very, very unclear. At the very least, they're not particularly mindful of God because, again, they never mention God directly. It seems to me that these people have kept their ethnic identity, but they've lost much of their spiritual identity. Or it seems maybe their spiritual identity, which might be there, has been greatly degraded. But why? Why have these people lost some of their holiness, or much of their holiness? I like to think about that for a moment. For that, we need to take a big historical step backwards. What are these Jews doing in Persia anyway? How come they're not in Judah or Jerusalem or their promised land? What are they doing here? Well, let me, again, go back to some history, and I'll try to make this quick and skip over lots of detail. There was this big event called the Babylonian exile, or the Babylonian captivity. You may have heard of it. It's really impossible to overestimate how devastating and traumatic this event was in the spiritual and national consciousness of the Jews. Before the Babylonian exile or captivity, the Jews had been persistently disobedient to God. And it got so bad that God allowed, through his providence, to allow the kingdom of Judah to be conquered by the Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar. Again, that name has come up before. I'm sure you've heard of that. So Jerusalem, which had been the capital for 400 years, was razed to the ground. The temple was burned. Tens of thousands were killed. And then thousands of Jews were forced to march to Babylon. And the Babylonians took the best and the brightest, the royalty, the nobility, the priests, the skilled craftsmen, and the military officers, and anyone with wealth, the best and brightest, the top whatever percent. The march took 4 months, and it was a 900-mile march through the wilderness. Many died along the way, and when they arrived, they cried, lamented, they were heartbroken. From an experience of unbearable grief comes one of the most beautiful psalms, Psalms 137. I'll just read a little bit of that. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. You should read all of it. Psalm 137 is beautiful. It's one of my favorite. It's sad. Their hearts are broken. They have lost their friends. The families have been murdered. They saw the destruction of their home. And they're in Babylon, and they're just weeping their eyes out. And they thought they would never, ever, ever go home again because home's been burned to the ground. But God did not abandon his people. The prophet Jeremiah, writing from, he was left behind, sends a message of hope and instruction from God in a letter. Jeremiah says, while you're living in Babylon, this is what he says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city, the Babylonian city, where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For its welfare you will find your welfare. So that's the message of hope. Jeremiah saying, God is punishing you. You're getting what you deserve, but God has not abandoned you. You go to Babylon. You live well. You multiply and prosper. And the Jews in Babylon did just that. They embraced Babylonian language and custom. They engaged in farming and commerce, and eventually, over the years, they gained wealth and status. They were thriving in Babylon, but the more they were growing in Babylon, the deeper they got into Babylonian life, the wealthier they got, the more the more integrated they got in Babylonian life. Their ties to Jerusalem got weaker and weaker and weaker. With every success and every passing year, their ties to Jerusalem just started vanishing. In the very same prophecy, a few verses later, Jeremiah gives hope, though. This punishment, this exile, will not last forever. It will end, and God will bring you back home. He will restore them. This is what Jeremiah says several verses later. After he tells them to live and prosper and do well, then he says this, for thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill you my promise and bring you back to this place, meaning Judah, Jerusalem, the capital, the holy city, the holy land. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So he's saying you're going to be in exile 70 years, live well, prosper, bless that city, they'll bless you. Your welfare is tied to Babylon. But then 70 years, your punishment is done. I am bringing you home. You're going to come back. You're grounded, not exiled. You're going to get out of here soon. And the prophecy comes true, and God intervenes. After 70 years of living in exile in Babylon, again, a great reversal. No one saw this one coming. Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia and Media, neighboring empire, conquered Babylon. Then Cyrus did something completely bonkers that no one saw coming. Cyrus declared in a royal edict that the Jews should and could return home and rebuild their temple and nation. In fact, Cyrus actually sent money and supplies. He underwrote and funded the rebuilding of the temple. And boom, just like that, Jeremiah's prophecy comes true. Babylon's conquered, Persia beats Babylon, Cyrus comes in, says, go home. Your exile's over. You don't have to be here anymore. And the Jews, who were the people who were living out the promise made to Abraham by God, they were given a mission from God to bless and save the world. Central to this promise was the land. They were aliens. They were living as aliens in a foreign land for 70 years. And now God is calling them back to go to Judah, to go to Jerusalem, and fulfill the promise made to Abraham to be a nation of priests for all the world. Sounds great, right? Yay! They all jumped at the chance to go back home, finally. No. Some of the Jewish exiles went back to the promised land, and some chose to stay in Babylon. How many went home? How many stayed? We don't really know. This is thousands of years ago. They don't keep careful records. There's no census. The scholarly answer to this question varies, but from what I could find, I found this discouraging. It's possible that a huge majority stayed in Babylon, or a small majority. Either way, going back to Jerusalem for these Jews was not the obvious answer. A lot of them stayed. They didn't take the option to go back. On the one hand, that's surprising. I mean, why wouldn't you go home? Remember all the crying by the rivers, by the shores of Babylon? I want to go home. You can go home now. Yeah, hard pass. I'll stay. I want to be here as an alien in a strange land. I don't want to go to the promised land. Why would they want to go back home? It seems obvious to me. But the more you read into this, maybe it's obvious why they didn't go back to their homeland. The book of Ezra records a rebuilding of the temple. The book of Nehemiah records a rebuilding of Jerusalem. Here's a really, really short summary. It was hard. It was awful. Imagine having to rebuild a nation that had been destroyed and neglected for nearly a century. They would have to rebuild homes, rebuild the temple. No government. They have to rebuild the government from scratch. Farms, no food. I mean, it really, really sounds horrible. But this is what God was calling them to do. Rebuild your land from scratch that had been neglected for nearly a century. Why? Why would God tell them to do this? Again, this is the original promise to Abraham. They were supposed to be a nation of priests, a holy nation, not just a spiritual nation, but a physical nation and a spiritual nation. And this was a means by God, this kingdom is a means by which God would redeem the world, bring salvation to the world. It wasn't fun, it wasn't easy, but this was a calling from God. Okay, that's one option. Like build God's kingdom. No, literally, not symbolically, literally rebuild the kingdom of God. And it's hard. Or on the other hand, you can stay in Babylon. Why would you stay in Babylon? Why would they want to stay in Babylon? Well, here are a couple of reasons. At this point, they had been living in Babylon, now Persia, for 70 years. And that means the vast majority of people, the vast majority of Jews living in Persia at the time, only knew life in Persia or Babylon. This is 70 years. If you're alive by this point, you're most likely born there. If you have any memory of the promised land, you're probably a kid, you're old, or you're probably dead by this point, and you're too old to make the journey. The homeland, the promised land, it was just a story to them. It was more like mythology. They never visited there. They never went there for the summers. It was just an idea. In the meantime, the Jewish families, following Jeremiah's command, built homes, businesses, and communities. Again, they achieved wealth and status. Going back and completely uprooting your life would be difficult. I mean, imagine if you had been living in, say, Manhattan for 70 years with your family. You have a job, you have condos, you have property, you have wealth, you have connections. And leaving, it'd be hard, just like that. You have to give all that up, and that's who they were. They were like established people in Babylon. Wealthy, connected, powerful. They didn't want to go home. It was too much to give up. Even though the Jews in Babylon probably maintained their culture and ethnic identity, and possibly even a lot of them kept their religious identity, life in Babylon was incredibly comfortable. It was like the most advanced city, most advanced nation in the world at that time. There's a lot of complicated historical details I could get into, but I'll just try to summarize the main point here. King Cyrus' royal decree allowing the Jews to go back to Judea and rebuild their temple was in 539 BC. Okay? That was about 60 years before the events recorded in the book of Esther. Mordecai and Esther and the community of Jews, 60 years after they were allowed to go home, are still in Persia, what was once Babylon and now Persia. The events of the time of the events of this book of Esther, by the time of the events in the book of Esther are happening, the Jews have been living in Babylon for over 100 years. These are the Jews that did not go home when they had the chance. These are the Jews who opted to stay in Babylon, now Persia. So here's my speculation. And I have to admit something. I have to acknowledge something. This is a minority view. Other scholars don't 100% agree with me on this. I thought about this, and I thought, this is my take on what's going on here. And I called up or talked to a few of my theologian, scholarly friends, and they said, that's kind of off. I'm not sure you're right about this. So this past week, I just happened to sit down with my theologian friend for about an hour, and I sort of laid out my case for what I'm about to say. First, he said no. By the end of 1 hour, he said, you might be onto something. He said, I agree with you with qualified points. A couple nights ago, I called up my friend who was a PhD in Bible. He's a brilliant Old Testament scholar, and I laid out my case. He said, yeah, I think you might be right. Okay, but this is a minority view. I don't think it's theologically heretical, but just not too many people agree with me on this. Okay, so here's my point. Asterisk, I might be wrong. I don't think I am, but I might be wrong. But the theology is still good, I think. So here it is. Esther and her community of Jews, they're not supposed to be in Babylon, now Persia. They're not supposed to be there. They were called home. They were supposed to go back and rebuild the temple in the holy nation, meaning they should have gone back. But they chose to stay. Staying in Babylon and Persia was prosperous and comfortable, but there are spiritual consequences. My theologian friend, who I respect a great deal, he said, well, maybe it wasn't sinful for them to stay in Babylon, but there are consequences, and you should be wary of those consequences. All right, so that's the qualification. I think they should have gone back. Maybe it wasn't sinful for them to stay, but I think the better option would have been the hard option, to go back, because there are consequences when you stay in Babylon. The Jews in the book of Esther seem to have become spiritually and theologically degraded. At least within the text of the book, they appear to have lost at least some element of holiness, of theological consciousness, of deep awareness of God. Something's been lost. I wonder if you could read the book of Esther as a warning. And this is a warning. This is it. Be careful. If you live in Babylon for too long and you're not mindful and careful and very vigilant, if you live in Babylon for too long, you will become Babylonian. Be there if you have to, but don't get too comfortable there. But this is not just a warning, it's also a book of hope. And maybe you've wandered from God. Maybe you've just wandered away from God. Esther and Mordecai were 900 miles from the promised land. And maybe it's been a long time since you were ever right with God. You wandered away from God, and it's been years since you were ever right with God. For Esther and Mordecai, their friends, it had been over a century. And you haven't read the Bible in a long time. You've forgotten more than you ever know. You haven't heard a sermon in a long time. You haven't been to church in a long time. Again, you've forgotten more than you know. Maybe you haven't prayed in a long time. It's been so long since you prayed that you don't even know how to pray. And maybe you have only some vague notion of God, most of which you've forgotten from those years ago when you're ever right with God. And you think you ought to call out to God, but you don't even know who he is anymore. You have forgotten. Maybe that's you, or maybe that's someone you love. Maybe you're worried about your kids who wandered away. You're worried about your siblings, your friends, people you grew up with. Or maybe it's you. Maybe you're here, but you just don't remember. You're here out of nostalgia. You remember once upon a time you were right with God. It's been a long time. The book of Esther is finally, I believe, a book of hope. No matter how far you are from where you ought to be, and no matter how long it's been since you were ever right with God, you are not beyond the love and grace of God. It is possible that the God you do not name, do not even acknowledge, is working in your life. That God is invisible and hidden, but he is actively working in your life, and he wants you to come back home. Let's pray. Lord, the God who's revealed and the God who's hidden, but the God who is always in our lives, always present, always working.